Alrighty, everyone, it's Michael Shermer, and it's time for another episode of the Michael Shermer Show. This time, my guest is the returning champion, Bjorn Lomborg. His new book, Best Things First, the 12 most efficient solutions for the world's poorest and our global SDG promises. We'll get into what all that means. As you probably know, Dr. Bjorn Lomborg is an academic and the author of the best-selling The Skeptical Environmentalist, I remember well, and his other book, Cool It. He's a visiting professor at Copenhagen Business School and president of the Copenhagen Consensus Center, which brings together top economists, including 7 Nobel laureates, to set data-driven priorities for the world. Lomborg is a frequent commentator in print and broadcast media for outlets including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, CNN, Fox, and BBC. His monthly column is published in 19 languages. I didn't know that. That's impressive. In 30-plus newspapers with more than 30 million readers globally. I get that. I get your newsletter via email, but I guess it's also, I didn't realize it was published in all those magazines and newspapers. That's cool.
Yep.
Okay, so we go all the way back to the 90s. Your first book, The Skeptical Environmentalist, what was that, 98, 99, something like that?
It was in Danish, yes, but I don't think you read it in Danish. So it
No,
was
no, no.
In 2001.
Oh, 2001, right. That's right. And your publicist, Sloan Lederer, was my publicist. So he says,
right.
Hey,
Yeah,
I've got the perfect book. It has the word skeptic in the title. And I went, oh, well. And I know I've told you this story, but for our listeners that don't know this story, when she sent me the book, I thought, well, I could see he's, kind of out there pushing the envelope a little bit on the accepted dogma about climate change. Maybe I should have a debate. I'll get someone like Paul Ehrlich or some big climate scientist and have a go at Caltech. And I couldn't get anybody. I mean, Paul Ehrlich basically said, if you put this guy on stage at Caltech, you will have a ruined career. I'm like, well, in that case, I'm definitely going to do it. To me, this is the way to deal with cancel culture. Is you just say, well, I'm going to really do it in that case. You push back, right? So, looking back, so 2001, right? So that's 22 years in the English version. So probably almost 25 since you started researching the book, right? Almost a quarter century.
Yeah.
So let's just broadly speaking, how is that held up in terms of your thesis of that book?
So the fundamental thesis was things are a lot better than you think. Fundamentally, when we get richer, when we get out of poverty, we actually deal with a lot of our environmental problems, and basically we become more resilient and less vulnerable. That is just, it's almost a no-brainer. It's not that this is surprising that it's held up really well. We know this from the last 200 years. So this is just simply something we need to understand. As we get richer, we do a lot of smart things. We also do some dumb things, and we're probably going to talk about both of them. But fundamentally, it means that we can do a lot more of the smart stuff. Just to give you one example, if you look at climate-related deaths over the last 100 years, they've dropped by somewhere between 98 and 99%. Why? Not because climate is not a problem, but because the fact that people who are less poor are much better able to deal with anything the environment throws at us. So it tells us that we are likely to be able to do really well also in a world that's warming. Now, if we could make it warm less, we'll do even more. We'll do even better. But it's not this end of the world. It's a problem, like many other things. And I think that was the main point of the skeptical environmentalist. Although I think I got thrown out in the deep water very, very quickly. So I think I say it with more certainty and understanding now. But fundamentally, air pollution's come down dramatically in most rich countries. It used to be terribly polluted in most rich countries. Take pictures of some of your favorite cities, Los Angeles or some other city.
Right?
I don't know whether that's a favorite city or London, that kind of thing. They used to be terrible places, and now they're immensely clean. Now, they can still be cleaner, and we should go for cleaner, but it's, the world has become immensely much better. We've lifted people out of poverty. People stop being hungry. We've gone over a century from about 2/3 of the world's population being permanently hungry to less than 10%. Again, there's still problems, and we should definitely be cognizant of them, but it's not this world that's about to end, which I think a lot of, especially young people, think now. And it's terrible in two ways, partly because it just sucks out your will to live and your enthusiasm for actually doing something. but also, it's wrong. And so wrong information is very likely to not make you make the best decisions.
Yeah, in Los Angeles, I grew up in Los Angeles, and bike racing in the 1980s. In the summer, you had to be done by like 10 in the morning, or else your lungs are just fried. Now you can ride almost any day all year, thanks to the environmental movement. They should take credit for
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Instead of calling doomsday. They should say, look,
And
it works.
also to a very large extent, thanks to technology. I mean,
Yeah.
this is partly because of the environmental movement, but it's important to recognize what works and what doesn't. It doesn't work to tell people in Los Angeles, I'm sorry, could you walk instead? But it does work to have them put on a catalytic converter. So, the point is we find technological solutions that have real costs, but also deliver immense benefits. And those are the kinds of things that we should be looking for.
I wonder if there's a couple of psychological factors at work here. First, there's kind of binary thinking, that it's either all good or it's all bad, and I can look out the window and see it's not all good, so therefore it must be all bad. So there's a lack of kind of non-binary or continuum thinking. And also, Pinker always points this out. To say that things are getting better, what people hear is, oh, so you're saying everything is perfect. No, it's getting better, and there's problems. That kind of both and, there are problems, and it's getting better.
I think you're absolutely right. I think one of the things is also you don't get clicks for saying here's not a problem, right? You don't have reporters out here. It's not burning where I am, right? I mean, that's just not. You will inevitably have people and camera crews sort of go to where it's burning, and so if you think that your TV or your reporting gives you the full extent of what the world looks like, you're very likely to be wrong. One good example of that is the U.S. over the last 30 years have seen declining rates of crime. Now, the last couple of years, more dodgy, right? But fundamentally, you've seen a dramatic drop in all kinds of crime. And at the same time, you've seen a dramatic increase in CNN and Fox and everything else. And of course, there's always enough crime to fill every newscast from one end to the other with crime. So over the least 30 years, where crime has been dropping, almost every year Gallup finds that people believe that there's more and more crime. So you think there's more and more crime, while the actual numbers tell you there's less and less crime. And that's just simply an artifact of us seeing more and more crime on TV. And likewise, we see a lot of problems on TV from all kinds of other things. And it doesn't mean all of these are probably true problems, but it doesn't give you a good sense of proportion. Because actually, had you had the same coverage, 30 years ago or 100 years ago, you would have seen much, much worse pictures.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it's also harder to see the long-term trends because they don't happen week to week or month to month. They're more like decade-long trends, and it's hard to see a decade. I just had Jean Twenge on the podcast. She wrote that book, Generations. And it's startling what differences there are between generations over the last century, but you don't see any of it. I mean, I'm reading the chapter about my own generation, the boomer, and I'm like, wow, yeah, that's right. We used to listen to that horrible music and wear bare bell bottoms and all these crazy, and then all of a sudden it just kind of gradually, not all of a sudden, gradually goes up. They have the availability heuristic also, whatever is available. When you're thinking about something, your brain does its own kind of Google scan, catches the images from last night's news, right? So killer bees, terrorist attacks, shark attacks here in California on the East Coast, and so on. But those things are not what's important. But no one covers like, oh, another person died of asthma or eczema has problems or whatever. And then there's also one other factor, the negativity bias, why bad is stronger than good. So there's a lot of research on this, that our brains evolved to notice things that could take us out of the gene pool, threats. And so we tend to overcorrect and see danger where there isn't, as opposed to the other kind of error, where you just fail to notice the good things that happen. Well, that's not going to take you out of the gene pool. It's failing to recognize the threat, right? So it's a type 1 error versus a type 2 error. And again, all your work shows that, in the long run, those trends are pretty good, but our brains aren't geared to look at that, right?
Yeah.
Dawkins always points out we evolved on the savannas of Africa. You don't see climate change over the course of hundreds of years. You see what the weather's like tomorrow.
Yeah. But also, again, you're the survivor of the guy who worried about the saber-toothed tiger, not the one who didn't. So one trend that I just find absolutely fascinating is the way that we've just pulled so many people out of poverty over the last 25 years. So actually, if you look at it, every day for the last 25 years, the headlines in every paper in the world could have been, over the last 24 hours, we pulled 138,000 people out of poverty every day for the last 25 years. And it's not, because it's just, it's no fun. Where's the fun in that? Whose fault is that? Right. So we end up focusing a lot more on bad stuff. And I think there's a lot of value to that. That's how we solve problems. We identify, oh, here's a problem, here's another problem. But it doesn't inform us well if we think the whole world is falling apart. And it doesn't inform us well if we think the most urgent problems are the ones that get the most media attention. Because the things that get the most media attention are the ones that have the cutest animals and the most crying babies and the best PR, right? Not necessarily what actually works best.
Like the World Wildlife Fund logo is a panda bear.
Yeah, it's not a microbe.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, one last psychological effect here that takes us into your new book. That is people's inability to, or people's tendency to discount the future too much. And it's hard to say what my future self is going to be like in 30 years. So the idea of saving $100 a month out of my paycheck for the next 40 years is just, I'd rather spend it now. And people just don't understand compound interest and things like that can benefit. Or in the reverse, a slight increase in the interest rate on your credit card, people don't even notice it. But in fact, it's a massive hit in the long run if you don't pay the whole thing off every month. So our brains are not really well wired to do the kind of cost benefit analysis you're doing in your new book. Well, your whole Copenhagen consensus program is on that. You're kind of going up against this tendency to discount the future too much. So we know, for example, that something like 80% of Americans, when they retire, will not have enough money to retire. They have a few $1,000 at most. They just didn't do it. So you have people like Dick Thaler who says, well, we need, and Cass Sunstein, we need this nudge, this kind of, what does he call it? Libertarian paternalism. We're going to give you a choice. You are going to be investing in a retirement account. Here's your choices.
Yeah. And look, at the end of the day, what I try to do is simply give people sort of good information about where can you spend additional money and do a lot of good versus a little good. And I think, that is sort of another way of getting around a lot of our inability to process lots of information. Look, most people couldn't be bothered and honestly don't have time to think about all the implications of tuberculosis or bad education in the developing world or something. But, if you can basically show, look, if you do this, you can spend $1 and do no good. If you do this, you can spend $1 and do $65 of good. Shouldn't we do that first? I think most people sort of, that sounds plausible. Let's do that, especially if it's cheap and, not that much money.
Yeah. All right. So I guess the question is, what's the long range goal? All we hear about is global warming and, everybody's going to be extinct and so on. By the way, that's another one of these, negativity bias ones. Doomsday. Now we have all the AI doomsday. What's the point of saving the climate if AI is going to destroy us all in the next 5 years? So you have these kind of competing AI doomsayers versus the environmentalists. So your Copenhagen consensus is, let's make a list. What are the things we want to do? So what's the overall goal? Saving lives, survival and flourishing of people, or get them out of poverty? What's the goal?
So an economist would say we have a lot of different goals, but we try to combine all of them into what we call social welfare. So it's both surviving. Typically people will put a lot of weight on actually surviving, their kids surviving, but also not being sick, being able to become more productive, have better environmental quality, all of the things that we put a value to. We try to estimate and then say, all right, if you were to spend some dollars on making this or that or the other better, how much better would it make the world in the sense of making people survive more, becoming more productive, being happier, having a better environment? We try to take all of those things into account and basically express it in $1 amount. So what you'll hear a lot about, and if you've had a chance to look at the book, we talk a lot about that. You spend $1 and you do, say, $65 worth of good. What that means is basically it says for every dollar spent, you will deliver a lot of different social benefits that when weighed together correctly and all that stuff, it'll deliver $65 worth of good. The point, of course, is that that's a really easy measure to understand. You spend a little resources and you deliver a lot of resources to the world. So we're trying to talk about all good things. Of course, in reality, we we don't measure all good things. We typically measure death, disease, income, environmental quality like CO2 emissions and sulfur dioxide emissions and a loss of wetlands. There's a couple of things that we do, so it's more granular. But again, I'm not going to talk to you about, oh, here we can do 1.4 or something, not 1.3, but 1.4. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about, the order of 65 or something. And that means it's okay that it's just reasonably close to reality.
So what is the value of a statistical life?
That's a very good question. And people feel very uncomfortable about this, right? Because, if you ask anyone, people tend to believe that we're actually asking about their own life. And of course, that's worth infinite. But, good people will say that all lives matter and that we are all, infinitely much worth. But we sort of show that that's not the case because we make a lot of public decisions on, for instance, highway design is one great example. We put in roundabouts in places where we want people to not die in traffic collisions, but we don't put roundabouts everywhere. Partly because it'd be really annoying and it slow you down, but also because it's costly to put in roundabouts. So you put in some where you can save lots of lives at little cost, but you don't do it where you can save very little lives at very high cost. And so implicitly, we actually put a value on a human life. In the US, that estimate is roughly, and again, I'm just emphasizing roughly, $10 million. So you will put in, roundabout if you can save one life and it costs $10 million, or you can save two lives and it costs $20 million. But you won't do it if it costs $100 million and you save half a life kind of thing. And obviously, this is a weak cutoff point, and there's been lots and lots of studies. Now, that's just the government making these decisions. So you might be a little sort of, is that true? But it's also true for us as individuals because we actually take more dangerous jobs for slightly higher pay, which of course implicitly, shows us that we're actually willing to take a little extra death risk for a little more reward. And if you try to, back out what is the value of a human life, it's surprisingly roughly in the same order of magnitude. So about $10 million in the US. I'm oversimplifying, and there's a lot of different things, but this is what the regulatory community and many others have come to roughly is that number.
And now, aren't those also court determined? Like when somebody sues Ford Motor Company for, and then what's the value of their lost loved one, and the jury has to come up with a number.
Yes, and those are the ones that sort of inform that decision. So we have this in a lot of different settings. The U.S. obviously is incredibly rich. In poor countries, you clearly don't put the same value on a life. It's not that they don't want their life just as much. It's just that they have a lot of other competing interests. They are not willing to put up roundabout for $10 million to save one life when there's lots of people dying from HIV or malaria and tuberculosis and many, many other things where you could save them for very little money that they don't spend. So actually, it turns out that the value is somewhat lower. So we estimate the value is $187,000 for the poor part of the world. So the poor half, the ones that the World Bank calls the low and lower middle income countries. So it's about 4.1 billion people. Is that the true number? Of course it's not. But it's a reasonable estimate, again, an academically defensible estimate, and it makes it possible for us to then say, all right, what's the value of, for instance, investing in education that delivers more economic benefits in the long run? If you get a better education, you become more productive, you make more money, but also your whole society becomes more productive. That's money compared to, for instance, investing in tuberculosis, where you can then save a human life. What's the value of that? Given that we need to estimate all these things, we try to make them so that they're actually comparable. Again, this is academically defensible. When you first hear it, it feels a little bit, really? Really? Do I want to do that? But it's obvious because in a world where we don't do everything, and we live in that world because we don't have enough resources to do everything, we do some things, but not other things. And so we have to justify why is it we did those things and not the other things. And I would argue that it should be because Well, we spent the money where it did more good rather than less good. Of course, that's not how it really goes. In reality, what we just talked about, we do a lot of this because it looks better on TV and, it has cuter animals and it had a better slogan or whatever it is. But in principle, I think everyone would agree we would want to do the best things first. And that's why I wrote this book, because we're actually trying to find where are the 12 best
title.
Things.
Yeah.
Thanks.
By the way, there's a good Netflix film in which Michael Keaton plays the lawyer that was appointed by George W. Bush to run the 9/11 Families Fund. Because the families were going to sue the Saudi government and all this. Would they have standing? And, we're trying to be nice with the Saudis and so forth. And so let's just go to Congress, and Congress allocate on it. It was like $64 billion. All right. So why not just divide it by 3,000 and whatever the number was, 2,987 who died, whatever it was, by the 64 billion, and then everybody gets an equal cut. Well, then people started to say, well, wait a minute. The waiter making $35,000 a year at the restaurant at the top of the World Trade Center, and then one floor below is the guy that makes $35 million a year, and his family's going to want more than her family, and that's not right. Of course, that doesn't sound fair at all. Like, why is your relative's life worth more than my? I love my person as much as you love your, and so on. It really reveals what a difficult problem that is.
Yes. But it's also one, and of course, that's part of the reason why we never have these conversations, because it's much nicer to pretend that we want to do everything. And that's, typically what politicians do. They pretend we're going to fix everything in the world for everyone, because that sounds nice. But of course, in reality, we don't. And that's why we say, instead of just pretending but failing, why don't we actually do the smart stuff? I don't know if you saw on the cover of the book, there's actually the conclusion of the whole the whole book. We show the cost down there, which is this tiny little bar, and then the benefit, which is 52 times as high. Wow. I had to battle with my with the designer to make sure that it actually was 52 times and not anything else. But the main point is, this is really an amazing thing. We could show you how to spend a significant amount of money and do 52 times as much good across all these different things.
Yeah. All right, let's go through those. Make the distinction for us between the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yes. So the world has, promised lots of stuff over hundreds of years. Politicians love to promise stuff. And typically the UN has made lots and lots of promises that haven't really been delivered. But back in 2000, Kofi Annan and a few other guys, and they were all guys, made a very simple promise they called the Millennium Development Goals. They basically said, let's get people out of poverty, let's get people out of hunger, let's get kids into school, make sure they get clean drinking water and sanitation, stop moms from dying, stop kids from dying. That was it. It was really a very, very short list, and it energized everybody. We didn't manage to make all of them, and certainly the reduction in poverty was probably more because of China than because of the UN. But we actually managed to do amazing good. We cut child mortality, so under 5. It used to be 12 million kids that died below the age of 5 every year in 1990. 25 years later, in 2015, it was down to 6 million kids. That's still 6 million too many, but it means now we actually have 6 million kids that survive every year. That's a phenomenal outcome. And part of this, not all of it, but part of it was because we made these very, very specific promises, and everybody sort of put in extra money. We almost doubled overseas development aid and a lot of other things. So we really cared because we set this very simple framework of saying, let's do some smart stuff. Not surprisingly, when it ran out in the end of 2015, the UN wanted in on the action, and they wanted to do this again. And they felt a little uncomfortable about the fact that this was really something that was decided in a back room by the Secretary General of the UN and 5 other guys. That was literally it. And it also sounds a little bad, right? So they decided, let's hear what the world wants. And so we ended up, at one point, we had more than 1,400 ideas of what the world should promise. And they ended up promising, they say it's 169, but it's really a lot more. We ended up promising everything to everyone, everywhere. So we literally, the US government, every other government in the world, the UN has promised that by 2030, we will have pretty much fixed all problems for everyone everywhere in the world. So we're going to, fix we're going to fix poverty and hunger. We're going to fix climate change and war and corruption. We're going to fix education, and we're going to also make sure everybody gets organic apples and community gardens and everything in between. We're literally promising everything to everyone. And not surprisingly, today, this year, 2023, we're at halftime for the promises from 2016 to 2030. We're nowhere near halfway. So we're probably failing on all the promises the UN and the US and everybody else has made. And that's why I wrote this book saying, look, we promised everything. Not surprisingly, that means you don't have any promises or you don't have any priorities. Why don't we think about where could we do the most good first? So again, I'm not saying it's wonderful if you want to do more good, but before you do any more, why don't we just do these 12 amazing things that for very little money can deliver an amazing amount of good?
Right. So you go through these: tuberculosis, education, maternal and newborn health, agricultural research and development, malaria, e-procurement and reducing corruption, nutrition, chronic diseases, childhood immunization, more trade, highly skilled migration, and land tenure security. So before we go through those, are there some underlying foundational structural changes that could be made that would affect all of them? Like, say, having a liberal democracy versus an autocracy, or having a open market and free trade with property rights and so on is better than a kleptocracy, a socialist state, or something like that.
That's probably true. But what we set ourselves for was to say, where can you make a change with money? So that's certainly not an uninteresting question. But we didn't say, if you could dream up your own perfect world, how would you do it? We actually said, in this world that's full of imperfection, full of corruption, full of incompetence, how can you best spend an extra dollar or an extra $1 billion and do amazing good? We actually, one of them, and you mentioned that land tenure security, that is actually about changing the ownership structure. So one of the things in most poor countries, ownership is sort of, you kind of own your stuff, but you never quite know. And that, of course, is really, really bad. If you're a farmer and you don't quite know if you own this land, you're not going to plant trees that'll only start producing fruit in 10 years because you might have been evicted, or improve the soil, or install irrigation, those kinds of things. And likewise, if you have an apartment, if you don't know if you own it in 5 years from now, are you really going to put in a new kitchen? This is a little bit sort of a first world way of talking about third world living. But it still says
kitchen,
So actually, there's a report that shows about a billion people in the world. So 1 in 5 people of the ones they interviewed believe that over the next 5 years they'll probably be evicted from what they think is theirs right now. That's a terrible thing. And so what we're suggesting is one of the solutions is that you should have more land tenure security. That means you put up a commission. We've done this, for instance, in Rwanda and many other places. You try to map out all the different rural areas. It's called cadastral maps. So you have very good GPS coordinates. Then you need to get down with each one of the communities and show them. So we believe your plot is this, and then of course, but I bought this from your grandfather, and that actually, and then you'll have a lot of complaints, and people will start figuring, this is probably right. Some of it will go on to court, and so it's important to have the courts ready to deal with all this. But they already do. About a third to half of all court cases in poor countries is about land, because it's very, very important, and it's one of the most important productive values that you have in poor countries. And so, if you spend that money on getting better maps, if you get some sort of conflict resolution, if you also improve the courts, and if you have a land register so that you can actually trade this, and you can trade your land with others, so it's yours, you become more productive. And it also means you can actually borrow and use your land as collateral, and that means you will have more access to capital, which will make you grow faster. If you estimate all of these benefits, we find that the total cost of this So a land tenure security will cost about $1.8 billion a year, which is really a drop in the bucket of what we typically spend. This is for the whole world, right? And that would generate benefits of about $37 billion a year, or a bang of about $21 back in the dollar. Yeah, one of those amazing things. You don't hear much about it because it's not a sexy issue. It just happens to be incredibly useful to making people better off.
So there, a structural component would be a court system, a legal system, a system that has documentation. Here is my property. Here's the lines. I mean, I have a house with land, and I get when I bought it, I got this map. And here is your property, and that on the other side. Because up by where I live in Santa Barbara, there's some cave paintings from the Indians. They're maybe 1,000 years old. And when I bought the house, I said, those are on your property. And then when I hiked down there to see it, my neighbor goes, those are on my property. I'm like, yes. Oh, so I had to check the map. I go, oh, yeah, okay, I was trespassing. Right. So that has to happen. So you're saying that's been a problem in these developing countries.
Yes. Yeah. And again, we're not suggesting that we magically can, what do you say? Flick our, what is that called?
A light switch?
Flick your fingers?
Click your fingers. Oh, yes. Right.
Click your fingers
heels,
and then...
Or click your heels like...
Well, that's a little too...
yeah.
Anyway, Wizard of Oz. But that we magically can make court systems become incredibly much better. What we're saying is we know from studies that if you spend more money on court systems in poorly effective countries, so not all of these court systems are going to do it well, and they're still going to be backlogged, but you'll invite in more maybe retired judges to take over that extra hump of work that'll come from when you do land tenure reform, and make sure that you push all this through in the next 5 years or so. It'll have some real cost, and the benefits will only come later. And we take all of that into account, and we assume that people are reasonably smart, but certainly not, more than average. There'll still be lots of incompetence and some corruption and so on. But if you do all of that, and if you assume sort of average outcomes, you will spend $1.8 billion, but you'll make benefits worth $37 billion.
Who does these calculations? I mean, do you have computer programs by now? You plug the numbers in?
No. I mean, we certainly, we use spreadsheets for this. No, these are academics. So this will typically be people. So the people who've done that are actually some of the leading land tenure specialists at the World Bank and some NGOs who've been working on this. And then we have lots of independent economists who've gone over their calculations. So these are all estimates. And again, land tenure is certainly not the firmest of estimates. I was also, this we started off with this because you actually asked the very hard question: can you sort of change the structural situations? And mostly you can't, or at least we don't know how to do that with money. But it turns out with this particular thing, we do actually sort of know. We've seen some of these things. Much of it will succeed, according to what we've seen in the past. And if you do that, not everything is going to work out. You get a benefit cost ratio of 21. So it's a great investment. It's not, the best investment that we're talking about, but it's one of those 12 best ones. We've set a cutoff point 15. So everything that delivers more than $15 back in the dollar is in. And that's how we ended up with these 12 best ideas for the world.
And where does the money come from? Is it World Bank or the UN or the EU, the United States, or all of the above?
Anywhere. So look, we're basically saying these are amazing investments for the world's welfare. So clearly, the world's poor nations should be spending more money on this. There are reasons why, for instance, we haven't fixed tuberculosis in the poor part of the world. It's often because the people who get tuberculosis are the voiceless people. So these are people who live in migrant camps and slum neighborhoods. It's not the rich people. Rich people don't get tuberculosis. Rich people typically don't get any of these problems because they're well connected, and even if they're not, they can afford to sort of buy themselves out of these problems mostly. But a lot of this is just not very sexy, and so we end up having a situation where a lot of focus is on some, these cute animals, but little on these amazing investments. So clearly, the developing countries themselves should be spending more money. And it's also, even though they're much poorer, it's still a relatively small additional proportion that they could spend. So clearly, this is an argument for them. you mentioned how I write in papers. We actually wrote this in 35 papers around the world, including Times of India and China Daily and many others, talking about where can you spend money and do an amazing amount of good. So we're trying to push this in developing countries, but clearly it should also be something that rich countries would give about $200 billion away each year on development aid. So it's just a fraction of that. The total that we're talking about is $35 billion. So just a fraction of that should be spent on these really smart things. It's not, because again, rich countries also focus more on the cute animals and all these other things. We should be focusing more on the really smart things. And then, of course, if there are any billionaires among the listeners of your program, they should be spending it. And we should just simply push for all of our policymakers and everybody else to say, these are amazing things. Shouldn't we do those first? So it's really the power of the good argument that helps people push this. Again, remember, $35 billion a year. It's certainly not, I don't have that money. I suspect you don't either. Even if you had the cave paintings. But in the big scheme of things, this is a trivial bit. It's the increase in pet food spending globally over the last 2 years. So, yes, we can afford this. I'm not saying that our pets should suddenly go, starving instead. That's not what I'm arguing. But I'm saying this is really a very, very small bit compared to most other things that we're spending money on. So clearly, this is just simply a question of saying, let's perhaps first spend money on the best things and then spend all the rest on all these other things that we care about.
I forgot to mention in my list there the Gates Foundation and whoever else in that private charity business. Yeah. I would imagine Gates would be interested in exactly what you're doing. He loves those kind of.
Yes. So I mean, the Gates Foundation actually funded this project. So I'm very happy that they did. I wrote an op-ed together with Bill Gates, but he is already spending quite a bit of his money on these things. So he's very committed to, for instance, tuberculosis, malaria, some education. Again, he's a pretty darn rich man, but he can't afford all of these things either. He focuses on some of these things, and I'm very, very pleased that there are people like him out there. But as we mentioned, I'd love to get Elon Musk to think more about, he's been talking about that he wants to spend money on doing good. I'm not sure exactly how much he actually spends. Likewise with Jeff Bezos and many others. But the point is, this is something that we can all pitch in on. And this is really just a question of saying we need to marshal very few resources compared to most of what we spend money on. And then we could do amazing good.
And the people that give the money to some of these poor countries, they have to give it to somebody. How do you know it's going to be used for what you want it to be used for? There must be checks and balances and updates. And like a venture capitalist calls the company every week. Okay, what are you doing with the money? And how's it going?
And I think that's where, and that's also why I'm not suggesting that we're not setting up a GoFundMe campaign and collecting money, because that's not what I do. I'm an academic. I try to get us to find out what are really smart things. You need either get governments to do this. So, for instance, the Malawian government, they're now one of the world's poorest countries in Southern Africa, is setting up one of our solutions for education. Across the entire country, and they're partnering with a lot of organizations, and that's one place where you could do this. Again, I'm not saying that this is going to be perfect, because I know the politicians that we've been working with them, but I actually haven't done the vetting of this. So again, this is why you would need to have the World Bank or a USAID or someone else, or if you think Bill Gates does a good job, maybe you should just do like Warren Buffett and give him the money and say, spend this well for me. So it's again, what I'm trying to do is simply set the conversation and saying, instead of us worrying about a few things and spending lots of money, much of which is not spent all that well, let's focus on these 12 first things that are really incredible first, and then, get back to all the other things we care about.
Yeah. How much of it depends on the leader of the country or whatever collective or parliament or Congress or whatever they have being kind of visionary to read your op-ed and go, yeah, we should do that. And then they just do it or not.
Look, if they did, that would be amazing. And so again, the reason why I wrote those articles, so we wrote 14 articles in each one of these papers in 35 countries around the world was exactly to give them the idea of saying, oh, maybe we should do this or that or the other. So we just finished an advisory for the very small island nation of Tonga in the Pacific Ocean. And they've basically looked at these priorities. This is something done just for Tonga. And said, oh, maybe we shouldn't do the thing that everybody's been talking about. They want a second sea cable for better internet access, but maybe we should focus more on some of these things where we can get huge bang for our buck. That's the kind of conversation that you have with all of these nations, and absolutely they could do it. But the crucial bit, I think, is what we try to estimate is if people do a reasonably good job with these things, you will get these paybacks. We're not making these, wishful thinking. Well, if everything went well and everybody was amazingly smart, then we could get these, bangs for the buck. We're assuming that people will be somewhat, are normally incompetent and normally corrupt and normally everything else. So, given all of that, you can still get these amazing paybacks.
Yeah. Reminded of Thomas Sowell's famous quote, there are no solutions, there's just trade-offs.
Yes.
You always have to keep that in mind. So tuberculosis, I had no idea this was still a huge problem. I guess probably most of us in the West don't.
No, because we fixed this more than half a century ago, right? The amazing thing is, 200 years ago, so in the 1800s, about a quarter of everyone who died from tuberculosis, or as we called it back then, consumption, right? I mean, this is, Moulin Rouge. That was the central Satine dies from tuberculosis, and everybody else died from tuberculosis. It was a huge killer. We estimate about 1 billion people have died from tuberculosis over the last 200 years. It's probably the biggest single cause of death in the world over the last 200 years. But we fixed it more than half a century ago when we got good antibiotics. And so we stopped sending people to sanatoriums and we just fixed it. And we don't have tuberculosis, or almost don't have tuberculosis in rich countries. And this is why it's still a problem in the poor world, because you don't know about it. I didn't know about it. Most people don't know about it. And we sort of don't really care all that much. But still, every year, 1.4 million people die from tuberculosis. Last year, in 2022, tuberculosis was, again, the leading killer in the world over COVID. Now, in 2020 and 2021, obviously, COVID won out. But the last decade or so, otherwise, tuberculosis has been the biggest killer. But we don't hear about it because it doesn't have good PR. But surely that shouldn't be the reason why we don't deal with it. Now, there are very simple ways to get people to stop having tuberculosis. Partly, you need to get them on treatment, and you need to keep them on treatment. One of the bad things about dealing with tuberculosis is you actually need to take pills for 4 to 6 months. I don't know if if you've ever had to take sort of antibiotics. It's hard. Once you get better, it's hard to keep remembering it. And certainly, you and I only have to do it for 14 days. But try to do this for 6 months. That's actually hard. And if you stop, chances are you'll actually develop antibiotic resistant TB, which of course will be much worse, and then you'll hand it off to other people, and it'll be much worse. So you need to keep people on the path. There's a lot of different ways to do it. You gamify it. You give people apps. You make sure that they sort of meet up once a week. And Tuberculosis Anonymous kind of thing, and talk about how, yes, I took my pills all the last week, and that kind of thing. And obviously, I'm partly joking, but those kinds of things are what tuberculosis advocates are trying to get in place, and it means that people take a lot more of their medication. The other part is that we estimate about 12 million people get sick with tuberculosis every year, but we only discover some 6 to 7 million of them. So there's a huge dark mass of tuberculosis, and that's what keeps the infection going. So we need to find these. In Bangladesh, for instance, they had some old, typically widows that, this was their fun thing. They would have like 15 families that they looked after. And then they would go around every week or something and talk to them and say, hey, so is anyone coughing lately? Have they kept on coughing? If they've coughed for 3 weeks or something, maybe you need to come to the clinic and get a test. So that kind of thing. And of course, this is not costless. But again, what we find is that you can actually, for about $6 billion, you can save 500,000 lives each and every year for this decade. You can actually, over the next couple of decades, save about 1 million lives each year. This is just a no-brainer. So for every dollar spent, you'll do $46 worth of good. This is just simply one of those things we should be doing.
It just reminds us it's a bacterial infection in the lungs.
Yes, it is. So it's a bacterial infection. That's why you can treat it with antibiotics. But again, you need to get, so there's a lot of stigma involved in tuberculosis. So if you get tuberculosis, friends will sort of back off from you a little bit. And in Kenya, about a quarter of everyone who get diagnosed get a divorce because people don't want to be associated with you. You may very well lose your job, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of lying going on that you kind of go to the doctor because you're coughing, but you actually would like to know that you don't have tuberculosis. And if the doctor is a private doctor, he knows that you don't want to hear it. So maybe he doesn't test you. He just says, oh yeah, that sounds like a bad cough. Here's some Vicks, kind of thing. And everybody is actually more happy until, of course, somebody dies from it. But the problem here is you need to sort of bring this out into the open and say, look, this is fine. There's a lot of people who have tuberculosis. We need to be more honest about it, and we can treat it, and then you don't actually pass it on, and that's the smart way to do it.
So it might be underreporting.
Oh God, there's definite underreporting, and that's also why we have this big DART number, because a lot of people have it but don't want to get tested, and that's why we need those old ladies going around and say, has anyone been coughing a lot lately?
Right. Back to Elon and these kind of bigger picture questions. He wants to electrify all cars and so on. And then we're off of fossil fuels for automobiles. And I always thought, that sounds great. I'm in. I got to support the team. But will it really have a big effect on global climate change over the next 100 years if all cars shift from fossil fuels to electricity? Assuming we can get the electricity,
Sure.
not from the electric ferry out of the wall, but from power plants that are not fossil fuel coal driven, but nuclear.
Yeah.
Whatever.
In the long run, yes, it will. It's not, it's certainly not the only part of the solution. So we're talking about 6 or 7% of global emissions, but yes, it will have a significant impact. And again, you shouldn't say no just simply because it doesn't solve the whole thing. But what you should also recognize is this is going to be phenomenally costly for two reasons. You need lots and lots of charging stations. It will be very inconvenient for a lot of people. The typical people who are talking about having an electric car are the people who have their own house. So rich, upper middle income people who obviously would just park it out there and have a charger. But a lot of people live in apartments. A lot of people don't have a place where they could charge their car. What are you going to do there? Also, people very clearly vote with their feet in the sense that most people are somewhat uncomfortable about an electric car because what are you going to do when you want to go a long way? And are you really going to sit around and wait for 40 minutes or whatever it takes to recharge it, especially if other people also trying to recharge it? So interestingly, in Norway, which is the world's leader by far on electric cars, of all the people who have electric cars, about 90% of them still have their own fossil fuel-driven car, and they drive longer in that car.
Really?
Because the truth is, electric cars are great for small trips. They're great for some people if you live 40 miles away and you can charge at your company. That's great. You go forth and back with the electric car. But sometimes you want to go for a long road trip, and then it's a terrible thing, typically. And people feel somewhat uncomfortable about having to make those charges off. So we see the same thing in the U.S. that people have about 90% have a non-electric car as well, and they will drive it about twice as long, twice as far. So the reality is there's a lot of problems, and I didn't tell the biggest one, which is just we'd have to massively upgrade our electricity system, both in the charging system, but also just we're going to use a lot more electricity. Now, in the long run, we are going to do that, and that's probably part of the solution. I don't think people quite have a sense of how big of of an investment it is. So Goldman Sachs estimated a couple of years ago that just the charging infrastructure is another $6 trillion. That's $6 trillion we can't spend on other things. And most people don't, certainly most nations don't have $6 trillion lying around just for this. So again, we need to make sure that we prioritize right. Again, the point here is not, I love, I think Teslas are fun, but they're just not going to be the solution for everything, and certainly not in the short run. And there are many other problems that are also vying for our attention and resources. And so we need to be sure that we don't spend a lot of money on the stuff that looks fashionable rather than the stuff that'll actually make a big deal.
Mm-hmm. All right, seg into your education through Elon's Starlink program. That's got to be super expensive to launch all those satellites. But I like the idea, everyone on the planet is online, accessible to all knowledge of all humanity, everywhere for free. That sounds like a great program.
Oh, and look, I think Elon, and look, this is true for pretty much all business. If we discard the fact that Elon's cars get a lot of subsidies, this is just a market-based thing. A lot of rich people are saying, I would like to pay for a Starlink internet connection. And that's great. Elon is just simply giving us a better opportunity at lower cost. That we should all applaud that. There may be some problems with it. I'm worried a little bit about having enormous amounts of satellites up there, because if one hit the other, then it could be useless for everyone for 1,000 years, kind of thing. So there's some concerns there, but that's not really neither here nor there. The main point here is what I'm trying to address are all the things where you can't ask individuals to say, well, pay for that. People will pay for Starlink, but it's hard to get people to pay for tuberculosis treatment, which they didn't know they had. And it's especially hard to get people who haven't had it yet, but will avoid having it in 5 years if we implement the stuff that I'm talking about for tuberculosis now. You can't make them pay, right? This is sort of essentially the kind of thing that governments or public institutions or philanthropists or development aid has to come up with. Little money spent really smartly can avert huge social cost or can provide huge social benefits. Those are the kinds of things that we should be doing. And so again, it was more sort of saying, to the extent that Elon and many other, I think, billionaires are thinking about, what can I do with some of my many, many $1 billion to do good in the world? It's worth pointing out that, yes, you can buy Twitter, but you can also, for $35 billion, make the world a hell of a lot better off.
That's great. That's a good analogy. Okay, what's the problem with education? Is it teachers or supplies, school buildings? What?
Yeah. So for the longest time, we were very focused on getting kids into school, which makes good sense, right? I mean, more than half of all kids were not in school some 40 years ago in the poor half of the world. So clearly, it's good to get them into schools. We have, in the poor half of the world, so about 4 billion people, there's about 500 million kids, almost 500 million kids who are in primary school. And they're unfortunately learning almost nothing. So they're in school, but they're not learning anything. The main reason here is that you have teachers who are pretty poorly paid. They're not all that much better than their students. And you have, like anywhere else in the world, you have all the 12-year-olds in one grade, you have all the 13-year-olds in one grade, and so on. But if you actually look at a typical, 6th grade or 12-year-olds or whatever they are, some of these 12-year-olds are far ahead of the teacher and are really bored. Some of them are where the teacher's actually teaching, and many of them are far behind and have no clue what's going on. Ideally, you would like the teacher to be able to teach each one of these students at his or her own level. But of course, you can't have one teacher do that for 50 kids. But there's one way to do this, which is called teaching at the right level, which is essentially, and I'm just telling you one of the stories now, if you put each one of these kids in front of a tablet with educational software, 1 hour a day. So they don't own the tablet. It's going to be shared with a lot of other students across the day. And 1 hour a day, this educational software very quickly sort of catches up on how good are you? Where are you? What's your level? And then start teaching at that exact level. That software can teach you so well. The other 7 hours you go to school are still the same old boring things where you learn almost nothing. If you just do this 1 hour a day, it'll cost about $21 per kid per year. But the benefit will be that that kid will, in 1 year, have learned what it normally would have taken that kid 3 years to learn. We're simply speeding up learning. Now, remember, they don't learn very much, so it's not amazing. It's just, pretty darn good. But it actually means that these kids will go out later when they become adults, become more productive, make higher incomes, but also make their countries richer. And that overall will mean that for every dollar you spend now, you will deliver benefits worth $65. So literally, we're suggesting we should spend about $10 billion in this every year. So this is the costliest single thing that we're talking about, but it'll deliver more than $600 billion, so more than $500 billion in benefits each and every year for the world's poorest. This is just an amazing investment. Again, one that we should be doing. So it's not about getting, yes, it's great to have all the internet at your fingertips and all that stuff, but that is sort of very first world kind of thing. First, we need kids to actually learn, just the basics. Just to give you one example of how little, so we work very, very much on getting kids to not be illiterate, so they can technically read words. But if you actually give them these tests, they give them these to 10-year-olds. This is one of the sentences that they have to read. VJ has a red hat, a blue shirt, and yellow shoes. What color is the hat? 80% of the kids can't answer this question. It's red, in case you wonder. But it's not difficult or anything. It's just simply they can't string this together in a whole sentence. They understand the individual words, but they just don't string them together. And that, of course, means that the education is almost worthless. Yes, they're technically not illiterate, but they are. And that's why we need to make sure that they actually learn a lot more so that they can become much more productive, so that their countries can get out of poverty, get economic growth going. And we know we can do this at very low cost, for instance, with this learning at the right level with the tablet.
So you're talking about something familiar to listeners, maybe the Khan Academy videos where you see those little 5-minute snippets on calculus or algebra or whatever. Or Brilliant. Brilliant.com is one of the sponsors of the show. And so I started taking their little mini courses like on general relativity. What do I know? But, they kind of walk you through, here's the problem. Now, here it is. Now you try to solve it. And then you get immediate feedback. And then go back and try again. And you just keep kind of grinding through it. That's what you're talking about. It's kind of real-time feedback.
It is, but it's much, much simpler, right? So this is not about learning relativity. This is about learning VJ has a red hat. Right. So it's a very, very different level of and again, this is important again, because one of the things that we say implicitly is we're not saying education is important. Everybody will say education is important, but we're saying there's a particular way to solve it that is incredibly effective. There are other ways that are terribly, terribly not effective. So to give you one example, Indonesia back in the early 2000s decided they were going to double their spending on education, which is a really, really nice thing. But doubling is a lot of money. So they actually hired another million teachers, and they doubled the pay for teachers. And the way they did it, they implemented in different regions at different times, meant that you could actually sort of pseudo-experimental test whether it had an impact or not. And one of the very famous papers that came out of this is called Double for Nothing. So what it showed was that you spent twice as much money, but there was no impact on learning whatsoever. Now, the teachers were happier, because they were being paid twice as much, but presumably that's not the main outcome of an educational system. But basically, you can spend lots of money and achieve very little. So, one typical thing that a lot of politicians will talk about is we need to get the class ratio down, right? So lower class sizes so that you'll have more time with the teacher. It turns out it probably is slightly good, but it's very expensive because you basically have to hire the most expensive extra thing, namely more teachers. So it turns out to be a very ineffective way to improve teaching. But obviously, it's one of those things that make a lot of people happy. Teachers can get more teachers working, and politicians can spend a lot more money, but you don't actually get very much educational outcome. On the other hand, with these tablets, so we include in the tablets that many of these places won't have electricity, so you need solar panels. You'll need a place to lock them up because otherwise they'll get stolen. You will still have some of them getting stolen, so not all of this will work out. We've all included all of that, but this is actually an incredibly effective way of doing this. Another way that we find, so this is being trialed in all of Kenya now. It's been trialed now. It's being extrapolated to all of Kenya. That you help the teachers become better teachers by giving them semi-structured teacher plans. So you basically say, look, this week you have to teach your kids about this. Go through here, start with this, then sum up at the end. You'd imagine this is sort of basic stuff, but if you're only slightly better than the students you're teaching, this is amazing stuff. It's very, very cheap. So it costs about $9 per student per year, but it makes the students learn so much more that it feels like they went to school 2 years in 1 year. So again, there's some amazing things we know work. Let's do those. There's also some very expensive stuff we know doesn't work. Let's not do that first.
All of this reminds me of that story about Warren Buffett's $100,000 haircut, I think he called it. It's like, what? Well, I get a $10 haircut instead of the $110 haircut, and then I put that $100 in my own portfolio investment, and over the course of 50 years, that $100 will be worth $100,000. Oh, all right.
Wow. Yeah.
And he had something like that with lattes. If I go to the Starbucks and get that $4.50 venti latte versus the 50-cent cup of coffee, over the long haul, if you do this every day for an entire year, times 10 years, times and so on.
Yes. And literally, it's just Starbucks has a lot better PR. So obviously, we've heard a lot more about this. But to the extent that this is actually the same service, maybe we should be focusing on that. And that's why we're looking at, for instance, these things, because they've been proven over and again in many different randomized controlled trials. We know what the costs are. We know what the benefits are. This is just straight up some of the best things that humanity can do. So again, we should be spending this money, and we have already included that we're not going to do all of it well. One thing that teachers worry about, and I think that's reasonable, when you put in tablets, they worry that tablets are going to take over their job. That's why it's 1 hour a day. Because most teachers, so you pay the teachers to sit in the classroom. You teach them also how to use the software so they can actually help the kids if they have problems, that kind of thing. Very important to get the teachers on board with this. And that's why the studies typically is 1 hour a day and not let's do this for all the hours of the day. But again, the point here is to say this is doable. It's something we know works and it will have amazing benefits.
So, and all the money you're talking about here is already being allocated. So to say an economic nationalist says, why should I care about these overseas programs? We should take care of our own people and our own nation.
And look, there's certainly a good argument for saying, I don't care all that much about the rest of the world, but surely we care a tiny bit about it. So Hume used to say, if I read about an earthquake in China, I might be very worried, but then I cut myself on the finger on the paper, and I worry more about that. That's fine, but we still worry a little bit about the fact that other people are really badly off, and so we certainly in the U.S. and everywhere else, we are willing to spend maybe 0.5% of our income or our GDP on doing good for the world. And then my point is just, why don't we spend a small fraction of that 0.5% really, really well?
Mm-hmm.
So it's more about saying, let's make sure we at least do the amazing things first, not to say, oh, let's spend lots and lots more money. So one fun thing, or it's actually not all that fun, but we talked about these sustainable development goals and how we promised everything to everyone, and literally because we're now failing on these targets, the UN is saying, "Oh, give us another $500 billion each and every year for the rest of this decade to try and fix some of it." They're very explicit. This is not actually going to fix all of it because then we'd need $10 to $15 trillion. Instead of starting to talk about spending $500 billion or even $10 or $15 trillion, maybe we should start spending a very, very, very small fraction of that really well first. So it's also a way to say, to this person who is very worried about, why should we spend so much money? Absolutely. Let's not spend a lot of money first. let's spend a little bit of money really well.
I recall polls show that most people overestimate by a lot how much money is spent on.
Yes. Oh God, yes. So people will typically say you spend somewhere between 10 and 20% of the U.S. budget on overseas development aid. And the real answer is I forget, but it's less than 1%. It's probably 0.5% or something. Yeah. And that's again because you have this sense of, oh God, government is just wasting all my money, all kinds of places I don't care. And I get that, and that's part of the sort of heuristics and immediacy bias, as we talked about at the beginning of the program. But the point is, I think everyone can agree that it's good to do a little bit of good. We may not want to do a lot of good, but let's do a little bit of good. But the little that we're going to be spending, we should spend in the best possible way. And the amazing thing is, just to get that number out there, I showed you the thing on the cover of the book, how little can do an amazing amount of good. We're actually estimating if we take the whole thing, it'll cost about $35 billion. But the benefit will be that we will save 4.2 million lives each and every year. Just take that in, how many people that is that don't have to die and can go on caring for their families and do better and make the world better. But also, and at the same time, make the poor half of the world $1.1 trillion richer each and every year. That's almost $1 per person per day in the poor half of the world. This is just, and it's both of those things, 4.2 million lives saved and $1.1 trillion for $35 billion. That's just spending a trivial amount of money, relatively trivial amount of money, and then doing an amazing amount of good. So that's the argument that I'm making. I think most people would sort of say, yeah, we probably should do something like that, and then get back to the thing I worry most about.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. There's also the moral element. We have a moral obligation to help people. But also an economic issue. If they have more money, they're going to be able to buy more of our stuff.
There you go. Yes. and they'll also be much better in all kinds of other ways, right? So a lot of people are very worried about, climate impacts and other impacts that are going to hit, especially the world's poorest. Because remember, everything hit poor people much, much worse because that's what it means to be poor, that you are unable to defend yourself against a lot of different things, easily curable infectious diseases or, climate impacts. And so if you want to help these people with all of those things, of course, one of the best ways is to get them out of poverty. And one way you do that is to make sure that the kids don't die from easily curable infectious diseases, that their parents don't die and leave them as orphans, that they get better education, that they get an opportunity to own their own land and improve it so that they will make more good out of this land and eventually sell it so that you will have a few farmers who will farm all of it so everybody else can be more productive elsewhere. All these things that we know are the way that you drive a society towards more wealth, more opportunity, and less vulnerability. That's the kind of thing that we want.
Yeah, the analogy I thought of was earthquakes. Since I'm in Southern California here, we have them all the time. But almost nobody dies in earthquakes, but the same level of earthquake in some poor South American country or Southeast Asian country, hundreds or thousands die. It's not the earthquake, It's the structure.
Yes, it's the inability to afford good structures. Yeah, no, absolutely. So again, vulnerability is something we can fix. We can't fix it directly, but we can fix it indirectly by making sure that people get better educated, that they don't die from tuberculosis and all these things.
So to the Greta Thunbergs of the world who say, but none of these other things matter if we're all going to be wiped out by global warming and climate change and so on. So you have to fix that first.
Yeah. And look, that's a true argument. I've actually always respected Greta Thunberg a lot because she basically says, look, I hear in the news all the time that we're all going to die if we don't do something about global warming. And you guys don't do anything about global warming. This is the meteor that's hurtling towards Earth, and you just seem to be occupied by, what should we watch on Netflix? That is an incredibly strong argument. Now, she's being misinformed because it's not a meteor that's hurtling towards the Earth. It is a problem. So, the UN's own estimate of climate change is that this will cost in the order of 4% of GDP. There's only one climate economist who've ever won the Nobel Prize in climate economics. That's William Nordhaus in 2018. He estimates the cost of unmitigated. So if we do nothing, which I'm not advocating, of climate change, it'll cost us about 4% by the end of the century. So it will feel like we're
4% every year, or
every year. So we'll feel 4% less rich than we otherwise would be. Now, remember, by the end of the century, the UN also estimates we'll be 450% as rich as we are today on average. That's especially because poor people will be much better off. So instead of being 450% as rich, it will feel like we're only 434% as rich. So
not even
yes,
noticeable.
It's a problem, but it's, it means the world will be much better, but slightly less much better by the end of the world, by the end of the century.
Yeah.
So there is a problem, but it is absolutely wrong to say this is the only problem, and if we don't fix this, nothing else will matter.
Okay, agricultural R&D. You want to send Norman Borlaug to every country in the world and have a green revolution?
So one of the things people, I think, don't really appreciate is Norman Borlaug, as you mentioned. He basically made the green revolution. There's a lot of other people, but he got all the credit, and I think is true that he should get a lot of the credit. He basically made seeds, sort of corn, wheat, rice, grow a lot more food on every acre or every hectare. That was an amazing achievement. And that's, people say that he probably saved single-handedly about 1 billion people from dying. How cool is that to put on your CV? So he also got the Nobel Peace Prize for it. But this was mostly for rich and upper middle income countries that use rice, wheat, and corn. A lot of the things that sustain people in poor countries like sorghum and cassava and all kinds of other things that you and I haven't heard about, we should give the same treatment. So the argument of saying that we should get people more food, that's absolutely true. But it's really hard to just sort of do that. If you start distributing more food, a lot of it will be corrupt. It'll be hugely ineffective. It's actually very expensive. Not a very good deal. But if you could get research to make these seeds or tubers or whatever it is more productive, this will spread like wildfire, and people will plant them just simply because it'll give them better crops next year. And so you can basically have fairly small investments. So we're estimating we should be investing about $5.5 billion a year. But it will drive development so that you will actually have an outcome that means you can produce much more and you will have lower prices. The produce much more is great for farmers. The lower prices is great for consumers, especially in cities. The total net benefit will be in the order of $184 billion. So for every dollar spent, you'll do $33 worth of good. The point here is, again, to identify where are the really smart levers. There's a lot of ways you can spend money on nutrition and not do very much good or even lose money. And a lot of countries are already doing that. But there's some really smart ways that we can and we're not doing it. So yes, I want a Norman Borlaug for the poor part of the world. We didn't do that the first time around. We should.
Interesting. Wasn't aware of that. Yeah. So my vegan friends tell me not only is it good for animal cruelty and factory farming, but it's also good for the environment. That, eating meat, whatever the ratio is of how much water and land you use to feed a cow, and then, down the line, we get it. It'd be cheaper and better for the environment to go vegan. What are your thoughts on that?
So I'm actually a vegetarian, so I'm halfway there.
Okay, halfway there. Okay, or vegetarian.
Yeah. So it certainly is better, but not very much. People have this idea that it's, I'm vegetarian because I don't want to kill animals, and that's an ethical conversation that people can agree or disagree with. I gave a talk at the Canadian Cattle Farmers Association. I think I was the first first vegetarian to ever grace their seminar. They thought that was hilarious. But the short version is that it does do a little good, but not very much. So it probably cuts your carbon emissions about 4% if you go vegetarian. But because vegetarian products are also typically cheaper than meat, you actually have more money, and you're not going to burn that money. So you're actually going to use it on a trip to Cancun or something. And so you're going to emit more CO2. Economists call this a rebound effect. So the net effect will be that you'll probably reduce your emissions about 2.5%. So a little bit. You could have bought that offset at a value of what, $30 on the Reggie trading regime in the U.S. So it's worth a little bit, but not very much. And I think most people would probably like to keep on eating their meat and then just pay $30 to cut the emissions elsewhere.
I forgot about those
again
companies
goes to the,
give money to offset your carbon footprint.
it basically goes to the point that we talked about before with Los Angeles. The solution shouldn't be to tell everyone, I'm sorry, could you live slightly worse lives? That's never going to work. You're not going to be able to tell people in Los Angeles, I'm sorry, could you walk or run instead of using your car because we need to get the air pollution down? The solution has to be technological, that we say you can drive just as much or even more, but in a much cleaner car. So with a catalytic converter, or maybe even eventually with a Tesla.
On synthetic meat and lab grown meat, is that a technological solution? Because we're not going to get 100% of people to not eat meat.
No, and look, again, this is probably going to be like electric cars. It'll be good for some. I'm excited about it. I love the Impossible Burger because it tastes incredibly good. I was not a vegetarian because I didn't like meat. I mean, if you don't like meat, it's kind of not an achievement to become a vegetarian, right? So I love this stuff, but I'm sure a lot of other people will love it for different reasons. Some will do it for environmental reasons. Some will do it because it's cheaper. Others will do it to avoid animal cruelty, and some people will say not in 1,000 years and keep on buying real meat, and that's fine. This is how we get some part of the way to a solution, and technological solutions. And of course, if you actually can make this meat, I have no idea whether we can do that, make it indistinguishable from real meat, but at half price. I would imagine only very few people at select events will go for the real meat.
Mm-hmm. I have a feeling this is a slightly harder problem than people realize, because I've been hearing about this since the early 2000s. And there are now more and more companies being funded, but I just think we have a ways to go. But on the other hand, the electric car thing happened pretty fast. It was 80s and 90s. You had electric cars, but they weren't any good. And then Elon got in the game. And then things happened pretty fast. So that could happen.
Yeah.
All right, childhood immunization. You want to wade into the vaccine controversies? RFK Jr. is
we're exactly not doing that. I think people have a lot of sort of understandings and on the whole COVID situation. I'm not at all getting into that. I think everyone agrees that vaccinating a child against measles, or making sure that you vaccinate poor kids against rotaviruses, which is the leading cause of diarrhea, is a good idea. It's incredibly cheap, and again, one that can very easily pay off enormously. And we're already doing this. Remember, around the year 2000, we were probably already saving some 5 to 7 million lives each and every year. Part of it, a large part of it, of course, was from smallpox, which we eradicated. It killed 300 million people of the first part of this last century. So this is a tremendous opportunity. There's a reason why we could eradicate that and not a lot of other diseases, because there's no animal reservoir. There's nowhere else for the disease to go. But that's not true for most other diseases. So that'll be harder. It'll probably be impossible to eradicate most of these. So we need to vaccinate people. We know that works. We've gone from about 800,000 people dying from measles to about 80,000, and we should go down to close to zero. We know how to do that. It's going to be more costly because we've now vaccinated about 80% of all poor kids in the poor half of the world. And getting to the last 20% is going to be harder because these are going to be moms that are further away, that'll have a harder time. The doctors will have to travel further. Maybe they'll also be more skeptical, all that kind of stuff. But if you invest and you actually assume that this is going to be a lot more costly, we still find that you can do an amazing amount of good. You can probably avoid about 500,000 deaths for about $4.4 billion a year. So simply speed up immunization, and that will be an incredibly good investment. We estimate you'll do $101 of good for every dollar spent. So again, just one of those things we absolutely should be doing.
Amazing. All right, last two, trade and migration, highly skilled migration. They seem to go hand in hand. I mean, why do people migrate? For economic opportunities. They want to go where they have a better life. So what's
Yep.
the right number, of open borders versus?
I think there's a reason why they're two different things, because trade is, things that's much, much less controversial. So let me just take that last.
Yeah.
The skilled migration, there's an obvious opportunity for people to better their lives, but also if you have highly skilled migration, it also means that you have a huge wage gap, for instance, for doctors or engineers from the poor half of the world coming to the rich world. They can produce much more, they can be much more productive, but also because we're gonna have a brain drain, we're gonna leave the poorer world with fewer doctors, which obviously seems like a bad idea. But it also drives more doctors to be produced, because if you can do this, more people will want to be educated as doctors. And these doctors also send back remittances to their home countries, which means that the kids there will likely be better educated. So there are benefits also, and larger benefits for the sending country. But the main benefit, obviously, are for the people who actually migrate. This is a very, very highly politicized issue, and that's why we say don't talk about all migration, but highly skilled migration that's typically more accepted. It's also where you have the biggest bang for your buck, because there's a huge benefit from going from a poor country to a rich country. And we're saying 10% more than what you have. So if you are a rich country, for instance, like Canada, that has a lot of immigrants, you're more likely to want to have 10% of a very high number. Whereas if you're a somewhat immigration skeptical country that only have a few, you'll have 10% of a much, much lower number. Again, what we find is simply the simple point that doing so will make everyone better off. It will not, change the whole world, but it will actually, the total cost is in the order of $2.8 billion, but the benefit is more than $50 billion per year. So again, a huge benefit, about $20 back in the dollar. The trade thing, that's, I think, more interesting, and it has a lot bigger bang for the buck. So all economists, if you ask them, they'll say trade is a good thing. Fundamentally, it's because if you and I are good at different things, you do what you're good at, I do what I'm good at, and then we trade each other, and then we both end up better off. That's sort of the basics of trade. What we forgot about that story was that if you sew t-shirts in rich countries, it turns out that it's a pretty bad deal when we open up for poor countries to sew t-shirts. Yes, we all get cheaper and possibly even better t-shirts, but you're out of a job. And that's sort of the Rust Belt conversation, that there are some people who actually suffer either from lower incomes or from just becoming unemployed. Now, eventually, you will leave the workforce because you retire, or you will find another job, but it certainly has a cost for a significant number of years. Most economists haven't taken that into account, and we should. So, we've seen the whole world turn much more skeptical towards free trade over the last 20 years. We have done the first study that actually tries to estimate not only what's the benefit, that is all the cheaper t-shirts, but what are the costs, all the people who lose their job or see lower pay in Rust Belt areas. So we do that by looking at the best estimates that we have globally. Many of them are from China, and we probably believe that China is a bad example. That is it's a worst case example. We also do worst case examples. So this is the worst case estimates that I give you. Overall, we find that the benefits vastly outweigh the costs. And this is also true for rich countries. So for rich countries, you get many of the benefits because we're the biggest part of the economy. So we would probably get about $7 trillion of total benefits from higher trade. But we also get by far the biggest amount of the disbenefits. So the disbenefits is about $1 trillion. So there is about $1 trillion in loss and $7 trillion in benefits. Now, clearly, this is still a great outcome for society, and it's certainly something where we could very deliberately say, look, we're going to help these people that lost $1 trillion by re-educating them, by giving them support to make sure that they come back in the employment system. So even for rich countries, this ought to be a good thing, but it's not a fantastic thing. And that's because, it's typically the poor countries who are really good at doing stuff cheaply, and that will hurt people who are good at doing these kinds of things in rich countries. But for poor countries, so for the poor half of the world, this is almost all upside. What we find is they're going to make about $3 trillion, and they'll have virtually no cost. Their bang for the buck is going to be $95 back in the dollar. So the point here is to say, if you want to help poor countries, we should emphasize more free trade. Yes, it's a bigger problem in our economies, but even here, it's a great common good. It's 7-1. It's $7 back in the dollar. But we should recognize that there are problems and make sure we implement policies to make sure that the people who are hurt by free trade are actually helped as well. But for the poor half of the world, this is just a no-brainer. And the fact that we've lost this understanding that free trade is great, especially for the world's poor, is a shame. And that's why, again, we're saying there's good academic evidence that shows this will be one of the best things you could do to make the poor part of the world better off.
Is part of the problem this kind of old mercantilist zero-sum game thinking about economics? If they get a benefit, then we lose something.
Oh, of course. But I think most people understand that as more, again, if you get free trade, we all get slightly cheaper stuff at Walmart. But some people lose their jobs. Who do you think are going to be shouting the loudest, right? That's, the people who lose their jobs. So there's this asymmetry between the very concentrated losses and the very diffuse benefits. And that's why we have this situation where over the last 20 years, many political parties around the world in rich countries have sort of turned against free trade. And that's just a bad thing. Not that, we're not still going to do okay, but we're sort of leaving huge opportunities for the world to be even better. And that's true not only for rich countries, but especially true, we're sort of blocking the world's poorest. And we should.
You happen to know what I'd have to pay for my iPhone if it had to be made in the United States? You hear this, right? We can't do it here because
I haven't heard that. But I would imagine it's a huge number.
Yeah.
It's already a pretty huge number, but it would be even huger, right?
All right, Bjorn, I know you have other interviews you got to do. Let's just take one last big picture look at things, like 1,000 years from now. there's this kind of Trekonomics, post-scarcity economics. At some point, we'll all just have a replicator, and I say, gray, Earl hot, gray, Earl, whatever that is. Or
it's important you say it right. Otherwise, you're just going to get really bad.
Yeah, right. In other words, there'd be so much innovation, so much technology, so much prosperity. No one would be poor. Some economists still talk about, but the relativity of poverty. Your house is only half the size of the neighbor's house. Even if you have a 10,000 house, you're not going to be happy, and so on. I don't know. What are your thoughts on the bigger picture on that?
So I think that's too big. I mean, to me, it seems like, yes, that's a problem for people 1,000 years from now, and I wish them good luck with that. But the problems that we have right now and here, and that's what. So I'm sort of dodging your question. Let me just engage with it very briefly. John Maynard Keynes was very sort of convinced that by around now, we would all just live in a leisure society, and we would all read, Plato and Marx and everything else, and we, walk around and debate. And we clearly don't, right? I don't know whether we'd be better off, but I think it's very clear that people are not predominantly focused on saying, I want time to read the classics. They actually want to go on vacations and do fun stuff and have PlayStations and big screen TVs and all kinds of other stuff, and big houses. And those, at least for now, still have huge costs. So we're stuck in a situation where we have limited resources. But I think we often forget that while we recognize that there are problems and we should deal with them, and most politics is not about the opportunities, but it's about all the problems that we want to fix. Politicians are great at sort of getting our attention of, here's one problem, here's another problem, and I'm going to fix all of them. Well, first of all, we know that that's not true, because the track record is that they might fix a little bit of one of them, kind of thing. So I would like to believe that they'd actually focused on some of the really smart stuff. Now, in rich world countries, there are a lot of other things that I have nothing to say about, right? The whole conversation about, town and country and how we, Democrat and Republican, all kinds of other things what should we be spending on our healthcare system and all these issues. That's not what I'm discussing. But I'm simply saying, if we also want to care about the world, we should consider a little bit that we can do amazing amounts of goods. And so in that sense, I guess the short version of the answer to your question is, if we get it smarter on today's big challenges, chances are we'll be at that wonderful place where we can just ask the replicator for everything slightly faster.
Bjorn, you've managed to stay apolitical as far as I could tell. I don't even quite know what your politics are. Maybe that's good. But everything is so politicized now, you must surely get asked, well, which team are you on? The right or left? How do you avoid that?
Yes. Surprisingly, I'm probably slightly left-leaning in Europe, which is just, means way left in the US. But again, my sense is that that's not what this conversation is about. This is really about making sure that we have better information so we can make good choices. And I think there's something beautiful about this particular book. And this is one thing I'm very, very happy about. Not only does it say, how you can spend little money, $35 billion, to make the world an amazing, much better place, save 4.2 million lives and make the poor part of the world $1.1 trillion richer. But it's also something that we can all agree on. This seems like something Democrats and Republicans could actually agree on, right? Spend a little money. Republicans will like that. Effectively, the Democrats will hear spend money, and the Republicans will hear spend it, effectively. But we're doing good. How cool is that? We can actually get sort of everybody on board for that. Again, after we've decided to spend this $35 billion, we'll all split up and disagree about everything else. But for that short little moment, we could actually agree on making immense good for the world for very little money. I think that's worthwhile to sort of enjoy it all by itself.
Absolutely. Okay. For our listeners out there that have $1,000 to $10,000 a year to donate, they can write off on their taxes. Where do they go? What would you recommend?
So unfortunately, I don't have a simple answer to that because this is about saying we should be focusing on these 12 big things. If you have, $1,000 or $10,000, it's not enough to start off something in Malawi, right? So one of our donors at one point decided he was just going to help the Malawian government. So that's sort of many millions, but not terribly much money. You can sort of do that. But you can't do this if you have a couple of $1,000s. And so the short answer is, make sure that your congressman knows about this. Make sure that the people who decide knows about this. Maybe send them, I don't know, a book. I'm not trying to sell anything. We're actually not making any money off of it. So it's not, but push those kinds of messages. Get your local billionaire to spend that sort of money. I would love that I could just say, here is where you should send the money. But that's just not what we do. It'd be a whole other kind of setup to find out, does this particular organization do this well? Support the Gates Foundation is just sort of a symbol thing, it seems to me. But again, I'm probably both biased and also I don't even know if you can do that. But the basic point of saying, look, this is more about making sure that we all get our priorities right. So push for this with influencers and policymakers, and then also make sure that people understand for very little money we can do amazing good.
That sounds good.
Knowledge, I think, is incredibly valuable.
Totally. Send your congressman that graph right there.
That's exactly right. Yes,
you only have to spend that amount, and then you get the credit for all of this.
There you go.
Politicians would like that. All right, Bjorn, thank you so much for talking to me.
Hey, thank you. It was wonderful.